The village of Kalinga was a place where every roof and cobblestone seemed to carry the weight of tradition, where whispers of the past echoed through narrow alleys, and where the sunlight often fell in patterns that reminded the villagers of old hierarchies. Life moved slowly here, marked by seasons and rituals, and the families who held wealth and power shaped the lives of all who lived in its shadow. Among them, none was as imposing as the household of Merrick, a man whose fortune and influence stretched beyond the village and whose word was law within his own walls. Amara had entered this household as a bride, a young woman whose eyes held quiet intelligence and whose heart beat with curiosity and life. She had been raised with stories of courage and kindness, yet none of her upbringing had prepared her for the suffocating control that would define her new life. Merrick, her husband, believed firmly that a woman's place was to be seen and admired, but never heard, and he enforced this belief with a strict and unyielding hand. Every time Amara attempted to speak, to offer her thoughts, or to share a simple greeting beyond the minimum of courtesy, she was met with a glare, a sharp word, or a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on her chest. The mansion itself mirrored his will. Rooms were immaculate but cold, decorated with opulence that impressed outsiders yet seemed designed to intimidate those who lived within. Servants moved like shadows, careful to obey without drawing attention to themselves, their eyes quick to meet the floor rather than theirs. Every corridor echoed with the sound of measured footsteps, and every whisper carried the risk of punishment. In this environment, Amara's voice, vibrant and full of thought, became a forbidden thing. It was a secret she carried within herself, tucked away beneath the layers of fear and caution, yet it pulsed within her, demanding acknowledgement. Each day, she watched the household function like a well-oiled machine of fear and obedience. The servants moved swiftly to anticipate every command, never daring to offer their own judgment or advice. Guests were received with perfect courtesy, yet their questions and laughter felt like a test, a reminder of the power her husband held over not only her but all who crossed the threshold. Amara moved among them silently, nodding when necessary, offering gestures that conveyed compliance while her mind raced with unspoken thoughts. She learned to speak with her eyes, to communicate through the slightest tilt of her head, the faintest arch of her brow. Her expressions became her language, precise and careful, a code only the few she trusted could understand. At night, when the household finally quieted and the servants retired to their rooms, Amara sat alone in her chambers. The walls, though luxurious, seemed to close in around her, pressing down on the words she longed to release. She wrote in secret, scribbling thoughts and dreams into small notebooks she hid beneath her bed. There, in the safety of her solitude, her mind roamed freely, contemplating the injustices she endured, imagining a world in which women could speak without fear, and dreaming of a day when her own voice might rise unrestrained. Even in silence, Amara was not passive. Her mind, her heart, and the quiet strength that simmered within her were active and alive. Though her words were trapped, they were not extinguished. Each day, as she endured the oppressive gaze of her husband and the careful, fearful movements of those around her, she began to understand the hidden power in restraint, the power of listening, observing, and waiting. Within the silence imposed upon her, Amara's thoughts grew sharper, her resolve stronger, and her desire to reclaim her voice more urgent. The household thrived on fear and obedience, but in the quiet corners of her mind, a revolution was beginning, one that would start not with a shout, but with the first whisper that could never be silenced. Amara had learned quickly that in a house ruled by fear, every word carried weight, and every sound could be weaponized against her. The oppressive walls of the mansion seemed to absorb even the faintest murmur, carrying it to ears that would interpret it as defiance. So she began to adapt. Her rebellion was subtle at first, a tilt of the head, a raised eyebrow, a gesture so slight that only the most attentive could detect its meaning. She developed a silent language, refined through necessity, that allowed her to communicate with the few within the household who were sympathetic to her plight. Each nod, each glance, became a message, a warning, a question, or a shared moment of understanding. But gestures alone were not enough. Amara needed a more permanent record, a way to leave her thoughts where they could be understood without alerting her husband. In the dead of night, when the house was wrapped in silence and the servants had retired to their quarters, she began writing. She used scraps of paper hidden beneath the folds of her garments, ink created from soot and water, a quill scavenged from the abandoned corners of the estate. These notes became a lifeline, a thread connecting her to the outside world and to the small circle of allies who dared to listen. It was Mira, a young maid who had grown up within the household and witnessed its cruelty, who became Amara's secret partner. Mira was quiet and clever, moving through the mansion like a shadow, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She had always noticed Amara's subtle expressions, the fleeting glimmers of defiance in her otherwise subdued demeanor. When Amara slipped a folded note into her palm one evening, Mira read it with wide eyes and a barely contained gasp. She understood immediately. From that moment they formed a clandestine alliance, a partnership built on trust, shared fear, and a determination to resist. Through Mira, Amara began to test the boundaries of her influence. She whispered to the young maid in hushed tones, crafting messages that could be carried to the servants in ways her husband would never suspect. A nod here, a small mark left on a tray there, a pattern of movements repeated at specific hours, each became a signal, a call to action that traveled silently through the household. The servants, initially hesitant, began to respond, testing the waters of subtle defiance, emboldened by the knowledge that Amara's presence, though quiet, commanded power. Outside the mansion, Amara discovered that the villagers themselves were wary of the truth. They had long accepted her husband's authority and the rigid rules that governed the estate, believing in the narratives he constructed about women, obedience, and power. Yet when Amara, through Mira, sensed small hints of knowledge, of injustices that had gone unnoticed or unchallenged, she realized that fear bound them as tightly as it bound the servants inside the house. They were frightened not only of the repercussions from her husband but of confronting the reality that they had been complicit in silencing someone who possessed intelligence, insight, and courage. Amara began mapping the intricate web of fear and obedience, identifying the weak points where influence could slip through. She observed her husband carefully, noting the moments when his control faltered, the ways he relied on intimidation rather than logic, and the subtle cracks in his authority that others overlooked. She understood, with clarity that surprised even herself, that her silence was not just a personal punishment, it was a tool of domination. By keeping her voice confined, he maintained the illusion of power and reinforced the hierarchy that placed women beneath him. Yet even in this oppressive environment, Amara's mind thrived. She spent hours analyzing human behavior, studying the patterns of interaction within the household, and crafting plans that could exploit these patterns to her advantage. She considered the timing of her gestures, the placement of notes, the careful use of whispers to convey truth without detection. Every interaction became a calculated step toward reclaiming her autonomy, a rehearsal for the day when her voice would no longer be contained. Mira, ever vigilant, became her eyes and ears in spaces where Amara could not reach. Together they coordinated small victories, a servant encouraged to speak a necessary warning to another, a message delivered to a sympathetic villager, a minor act of defiance that sowed seeds of uncertainty in the minds of those who enforced obedience. These victories were subtle, almost invisible to anyone outside their circle, but to Amara they were monumental. Each one reinforced her growing belief that the house, for all its grandeur and intimidation, was not invincible. Amara also began to experiment with the rhythm and tone of her whispers, discovering that sound could travel in ways her husband did not anticipate. A note left on a windowsill, a soft hum beneath the bedboards, a series of taps on a wall. Each carried meaning, each bypassed the mechanisms of control that her husband had established. Through this secret communication, she realized that her voice, though muted in conventional terms, was never truly silenced. It could move unseen, travel unrecognized, and influence without direct confrontation. As days turned into weeks, Amara's confidence grew. She recognized that the very silence imposed upon her was a tool that could be transformed into power. While her husband believed he had reduced her to a shadow of obedience, she was quietly building influence, weaving connections, and mastering the art of subtle rebellion. Each act of communication, each whispered message, each note slipped into a servant's hand, was a step toward reclaiming her autonomy. Amara's resolve solidified into a plan. She would no longer be defined by the forced quiet, nor by the fear that gripped the household. Instead, she would harness the power of her hidden voice, letting it ripple outward in ways that could not be ignored or suppressed. The mansion, the servants, the villagers, all of them were pieces on a board she had begun to control. In the stillness of her chambers, she whispered to herself, a vow as quiet as it was resolute. One day they would hear her, and they would have no choice but to acknowledge the strength that had grown in the spaces where they tried to silence her. In that quiet rebellion, Amara discovered the truth. Silence was not submission and oppression was not victory. Each note, each gesture, each whisper was a seed, and she would let them grow into a force so undeniable that no one, not even her husband, could ever make her voice disappear again. The stage for her reclamation was set, and with Mira at her side, Amara was ready to turn the whispers of rebellion into the thunder of truth. Amara's nights had become a ritual of secrecy and quiet determination. Each evening, after the household had settled into its oppressive routine of fear and silence, she would retreat to the attic of the mansion, a space that had long been abandoned and forgotten. Dust hung thick in the air, and cobwebs stretched across old beams like fragile threads of memory, yet within this forgotten room she felt a strange sense of possibility. It was here, hidden among stacks of neglected furniture and crumbling boxes, that she discovered the first of many secrets that would change her life forever. An ancient, leather-bound book, its cover worn and inscribed with symbols she did not immediately recognize. The pages smelled of time itself, a mixture of parchment and lingering incense, and as Amara turned them carefully, she realized this was no ordinary book. It contained songs, chants, and stories from a lineage of women who had, for centuries, lived under oppression yet found ways to assert power without speaking aloud. There were lessons in tone, rhythm, and vibration, methods for sending messages through wind, water, and even the flicker of flames. Some of the passages described a form of magic that intertwined sound and intent, allowing a person to communicate forcefully without ever uttering a word that could be overheard or punished. Amara's heart raced as she absorbed the text. Here was proof that she was not alone, that generations before her had faced similar chains and had found ways to rise above them. She read stories of women who had spoken to the wind and moved objects without touching them, women whose art and music carried influence far beyond the limits of their confined homes. Slowly, she began to practice the exercises outlined in the book, starting with small, subtle manipulations. A hum carried through the wood floors, a note of her song made to travel on the drafts of air through the corridors. Each success, no matter how tiny, was a spark of liberation. Mira, always faithful and observant, soon became her confidant in these secret lessons. The young maid learned to recognize the signs and signals embedded in Amara's practice. The slight flick of her fingers, the tone of her whispered chants, the way she tilted her head to catch a passing breeze. Together, they experimented with sending messages that could be understood without a single word being heard by the oppressive ear of her husband. Amara discovered that her emotions could be imbued into her silent actions, that grief could resonate as a warning, and that determination could travel like a whisper through the house. The learning was not without challenges. There were nights when she faltered, when a note fell unread, a sound went unheard, or the wind failed to carry her intention. But each failure became a lesson. She honed her focus, learning that her strength lay not just in the knowledge she had gained, but in the discipline and intent with which she applied it. She experimented with different methods, tracing symbols on the floors that glimmered faintly when touched by candlelight, humming sequences that traveled through the stone walls, and manipulating small objects in the house with movements synchronized to her internal energy. Every act, though subtle, became a thread in a growing network of influence that her husband could not detect. Amara began to feel her strength blossom in ways she had never imagined. She was no longer simply surviving in the shadow of her husband's authority, she was learning to operate within the constraints of his control, turning his very rules into a framework for her empowerment. Her body, mind, and spirit became instruments of a hidden language, a voice that could move unseen and unheard, carrying her presence and intent wherever she needed it to go. Over time, she realized that the house itself had become her classroom. The creak of a floorboard, the sway of a curtain, the flicker of candlelight, each became a medium through which her messages could travel. The servants, already emboldened by her prior gestures, began to notice subtle changes. A flicker of light here, a small object moved there, a note of music that seemed to drift through the hall. They did not fully understand how she accomplished it, but they felt the difference and responded with cautious hope and renewed loyalty. By the weeks of study and practice, Amara had transformed from a silent, trapped figure into a woman discovering the breadth of her own potential. She no longer simply endured her husband's rule, she navigated it, bending its rigid structures to her own purposes. The voice that could not be silenced was taking shape within her, a force both subtle and undeniable, capable of altering the environment, influencing the household, and preparing her for the day when her message could no longer be contained. In the quiet of the attic, bathed in the dim glow of candlelight and the soft rustle of turning pages, Amara felt a thrill she had never known before. Here, amidst shadows and forgotten relics, she was reclaiming herself. She was learning that power need not roar to be felt, that the smallest whisper, when guided with intent, could move mountains. And with each passing night, her confidence deepened. Soon she would discover just how far her newfound voice could reach, and the house that had sought to silence her would never be the same again. Amara's discovery of the hidden voice had transformed her nights into a laboratory of possibility. In the quiet hours, when the mansion lay in stillness and the oppressive presence of her husband seemed to fade into the shadows, she began testing the limits of her newfound abilities. At first, her experiments were small and careful, subtle vibrations in the air, a whisper carried just beyond the walls of her chamber. Yet even these minimal gestures had an impact. A candle flickered without wind, a small cup trembled on its saucer, and the family cat, usually aloof and timid, would pause, ears pricked, as though acknowledging a silent command. The thrill of this newfound power sent shivers through her. Amara realized that her voice could travel through more than sound alone. It could move through objects, animals, and even the very structure of the mansion. A whisper here could cause a small object to tilt. A hum there could carry emotion to another heart. She practiced for hours, learning to modulate the strength and intention behind each word, each vibration, until she could control the reactions precisely. Nothing was wasted, nothing random. Each movement became deliberate, a channel for influence without direct speech. Mira, ever observant, continued to assist her. Together, they experimented with subtle messages to the servants. A spoon sliding across a table, a lantern shifting its flame, a quiet hum that seemed to brush against the mind rather than the ear. The household began to respond, imperceptibly at first, then with a growing awareness that there was a force behind these subtle changes. Servants started making small, autonomous decisions that mirrored Amara's intent, moving quietly to protect one another, leaving notes where they could be seen, and carrying out tasks with unusual precision. The mansion, once rigidly controlled by fear, began to hum with hidden activity, all orchestrated by the woman who had been told she should not speak. Encouraged by these successes, Amara turned her attention beyond the walls of the house. The villagers, long cowed by her husband's authority, were accustomed to silence and submission. Yet when she whispered to the wind in carefully chosen moments, near open windows, across the edges of courtyards, or in the branches of trees that brushed against the estate, messages traveled further than she expected. Birds seemed to carry her words, landing in specific places as though delivering instructions. Dogs barked at the intended recipients, guiding them subtly toward her meaning. Even sympathetic neighbors, previously timid and unsure, began noticing small changes in the household's behavior, curious signals that something beyond human influence was at work. Amara began recording her experiments in a secret notebook, detailing which gestures, hums, and whispers produced the desired results. She mapped the flow of energy, the patterns of response, and the most effective methods for sending messages without detection. Each experiment increased her confidence, proving to her that the silence imposed by her husband was not a prison but a canvas, a medium through which she could communicate with precision and strength. Her mind, once constrained by fear and oppression, now bristled with plans. She realized that the cruelty of her husband and the household could no longer remain hidden if she played her cards correctly. Through her silent but powerful voice, she could reveal the injustices, empower those who had suffered in silence, and prepare for a confrontation that did not rely on shouting or direct defiance. The knowledge that she had a voice that could travel unseen and unheard became a source of exhilaration, a quiet rebellion growing into strategy. Amara practiced daily, perfecting the subtle nuances of intention, learning to align her emotions with the energy she released. Her movements became deliberate, her focus unwavering, and her confidence surged with every successful trial. What had once been a silent, powerless existence had transformed into mastery of a hidden realm, a domain where her words, though unheard by those who sought to oppress her, could influence, guide, and awaken. By the time she had mastered these initial techniques, Amara understood a vital truth. Her voice could not be confined, and her silence was no longer a limitation. It was a tool, a hidden weapon, and a source of liberation. With every whisper that traveled unseen, every object that moved at her will, every sympathetic heart touched by her subtle power, she grew closer to the day when she would no longer endure oppression in silence, but instead, make the truth impossible to ignore. The first echo had been sent, and it resonated with the promise of transformation. The household had always moved to the rhythm of fear. Every servant, every guest, every footstep seemed orchestrated to maintain the illusion of her husband's absolute control. Yet, in recent weeks, an imperceptible shift had begun to ripple through the mansion. Amara, who had once appeared fragile, compliant, and silenced, now radiated a quiet strength that unsettled even the most loyal attendants. She walked with a measured grace, her eyes alert, her posture confident, as if she carried a secret the walls themselves could not contain. The servants, though cautious, noticed the subtle difference. A tension in the air, a vibration in the floorboards, the faint hum of intention that seemed to precede her every movement. Small acts of rebellion began to emerge, almost invisible to the untrained eye. A tray placed slightly off-center on a table, a candle extinguished in the precise moment to avoid attention but still alter the room's dynamics, a note left for a hesitant servant with instructions that could prevent a disaster. All these things were manifestations of Amara's influence. Her husband, preoccupied with asserting his authority, remained unaware of the subtle undercurrent flowing beneath his notice. Yet he could feel it in small ways, a door that seemed to resist closure, a chill in the air that could not be explained, a flicker of defiance in the eyes of his servants. Amara's silent power did more than influence objects. It touched people in unexpected ways. The servants who once cowered under her husband's gaze began to act with quiet autonomy. They moved with purpose, protected one another, and subtly resisted commands that would have previously gone unquestioned. The household itself became an ecosystem in which fear and obedience were no longer the only forces at play. Amara had become the hidden center of authority, her influence spreading without her voice ever being heard. Outside the mansion, the villagers began to sense the shift as well. The air seemed charged when they approached the estate, as though the very walls carried an unseen energy. Birds would gather in unusual patterns on the roofs, dogs would bark at unseen presences, and even the wind seemed to carry whispers that could not be traced to a human source. Those who had long feared the household began to notice that something, or someone, was stirring beneath the surface. Rumors spread quietly, that the young mistress, long silenced, now had an influence that extended beyond the estate itself, that the servants, previously cowed, were behaving in ways that suggested guidance from a hidden hand. Amara, aware of these perceptions, felt a surge of determination. She had spent months perfecting her mastery over subtle communication, honing her ability to send messages through objects, gestures, and whispers carried by the air. Now, as the household began to shift beneath her silent direction, she realized that the time was approaching when her influence could be wielded to its fullest extent. The careful training, the experiments with tone and vibration, the silent collaboration with Mira, all of it had prepared her for this moment. Yet she remained cautious. Power, even when exercised invisibly, could provoke retaliation. Her husband's pride and control were formidable, and any misstep could alert him to the growing rebellion. She observed him constantly, noting his routines, his assumptions, and the gaps in his awareness. She learned the precise moments when he was distracted, the places where his authority did not reach, and the vulnerabilities in his dominion. Each insight became a tool, each observation a potential lever to tip the balance in her favor. The mansion itself seemed to respond to her presence. The floors carried her intentions, the walls absorbed and echoed her silent commands, and the wind moved as if guided by an unseen hand. Objects shifted in alignment with her thoughts, animals responded to her mood, and even the servants' hearts were subtly steered toward courage and empathy. Amara's silent mastery was no longer confined to theory, it was tangible, a living force that could be felt even if it could not be named. Amara understood the gravity of what she had become. Her husband's control, long thought absolute, was no longer unchallenged. Each act of quiet defiance, each subtle manipulation, each ripple of influence was a step toward breaking the chains that had bound her. And as the villagers, servants, and even the elements themselves began to sense the unseen storm building, she felt the first thrill of liberation. The air of quiet power surrounding her grew stronger with every passing day, promising a confrontation in which silence would no longer mean weakness, and oppression would find itself powerless against a voice that could not be silenced. The breaking point came unexpectedly, yet it had been building for months, a tension woven through the mansion like an invisible current. That evening, her husband's cruelty crossed a line that even the most obedient servants could no longer silently endure. One of the younger maids, timid and trembling, had accidentally dropped a tray of delicate dishes while serving at dinner. The clatter drew the husband's wrath immediately, his face contorted in rage. He seized the girl by the arm, yanking her roughly to her feet, his voice a harsh crescendo that demanded submission. Amara's chest tightened. She had long observed such acts in silence, honing her powers quietly, testing her influence in small ways. But this, the fear and humiliation inflicted upon another living being, ignited something fierce within her. She could not stand by any longer. Every lesson from her mentor, every whispered chant, every subtle manipulation of the air and objects around her now converged into a single focused purpose. To act, to let her voice be heard in a form that could no longer be ignored. She stepped forward, though her lips remained sealed. The room seemed to pause, as if the mansion itself sensed the surge of intent emanating from her. She raised her hands slightly, almost imperceptibly, and directed all her focus toward the oppressive presence of her husband. The air shifted. Candles trembled and flickered wildly, though no wind entered the room. Silverware slid slowly across tables, chairs rocked subtly as though moved by unseen hands. The young maid, frozen in fear moments before, felt a warmth wash over her, an assurance that she would not be harmed further. Her husband's anger faltered first as he sensed the shift in the atmosphere. He stomped toward her, intending to assert dominance, but the very room seemed to resist his motion. Objects nudged him aside, doors seemed to close of their own accord, and a low hum, resonant and powerful, vibrated through the walls. For the first time he felt his authority threatened in a way he could not comprehend or control. He called out, demanding silence and obedience, but his voice seemed swallowed, muted by forces beyond his understanding. Amara's influence spread further, reaching the edges of the mansion and even the nearby village. Windows rattled, lanterns swayed, and animals stirred in agitation. A flock of birds took flight from the estate grounds, carrying with them a sense of warning. Those who had previously feared stepping forward now watched with wide eyes, sensing a power that could not be contained. The villagers whispered among themselves, realizing that something extraordinary was occurring, that the young mistress, long silenced, was now wielding an energy that transcended the limits of ordinary human authority. Her husband's expression shifted from confusion to genuine fear. He saw servants moving with unusual confidence, objects reacting to invisible forces, and the very air charged with an unseen tension. Each subtle act of Amara's will compounded, creating an undeniable presence he could no longer dismiss. He realized with growing dread that the control he had maintained for so long was slipping through his fingers like sand. The mansion, which had once been a fortress of obedience, was now a stage for a silent rebellion that he could neither hear nor command. Amara maintained her focus, directing her influence carefully to minimize harm yet assert dominance. The young maid was freed from the husband's grasp without him understanding how. Plates balanced themselves, the fallen tray lifted and set gently on the table, and the servants who had cowered in fear found themselves standing straighter, empowered by the unseen force. Amara's silent voice was no longer a mere experiment. It had become an instrument of justice, precise and impossible to ignore. As the evening drew on, the husband's fear deepened. He had long believed that silence and intimidation were sufficient to maintain control, but the invisible power now surging through the house shattered that illusion. He could no longer dismiss the signs, the flickering flames, the trembling furniture, the resolute expressions of those he thought subservient. Every subtle act of rebellion, amplified by Amara's hidden voice, revealed the fragility of his dominance. By the end of the night, it was clear to all present that the balance had shifted. Amara, though still physically silent, commanded attention with an authority that words alone could never achieve. Her hidden voice had spoken in a way that could not be ignored, leaving her husband shaken and fearful, the household aware of a power far beyond ordinary comprehension, and the villagers witnessing a quiet, transformative force that heralded a new era. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, the first undeniable demonstration of Amara's true strength. Amara had learned that true power did not require permission. 4 months she had nurtured her hidden voice, testing it carefully, mastering its subtle ways, and directing its influence with precision. But now, after the events of the breaking point, she embraced it fully, allowing it to flow through her without restraint, reaching all who needed to hear her without uttering a single word. The mansion, once a fortress of fear and obedience, had become her conduit, and the invisible threads of her authority extended far beyond its walls. She began with the servants, those timid souls who had long endured punishment and cruelty. Through her unseen voice, she imbued them with courage and clarity. A gesture here, a subtle hum there, and they began to act with purpose, speaking truth where before only silence had prevailed. Tasks were executed with precision and empathy, decisions were made with confidence, and a quiet respect for justice permeated the household. The invisible energy she projected was unmistakable. It inspired action, demanded attention, and cultivated loyalty not through fear, but through recognition of her presence and authority. Beyond the walls of the estate, the villagers began to perceive the subtle shifts. At first they noticed small, inexplicable phenomena, a gentle wind that guided them safely through treacherous paths, birds that seemed to carry urgent messages, and distant echoes of whispers that gave direction or caution. Soon they realized that these signs were linked to Amara. The stories spread quietly but with increasing urgency. The young woman who had once been silent now moved unseen, her influence touching all who needed guidance. People began to act in alignment with the intentions she wove through the air, finding courage and insight in ways they could not fully explain. Even her family, who had long dismissed her as powerless, began to sense the change. Her husband, once confident in his absolute control, grew increasingly unsettled. Each attempt to assert authority was subtly undermined. Doors refused to close, objects shifted to disarm or distract, and the household seemed to respond to her will rather than his commands. He could feel her presence everywhere, though he could neither locate nor silence it. For the first time he confronted the reality that his power was not absolute and that Amara's influence had grown beyond his control. Amara's mastery of her unseen voice extended to communication with precision. She could direct thoughts, inspire reflection, or even prevent harm, all without uttering a sound. When a servant faltered or a villager hesitated in the face of injustice, she nudged their conscience, whispering through intention and presence rather than words. Her authority was undeniable, felt in every corner of the estate and echoed throughout the village. Those who listened carefully felt a resonance in their hearts, a recognition of truth, justice, and compassion. Despite the growing reach of her power, Amara remained calm. There was no anger, no desire for vengeance. Her focus was clarity and purpose. The energy she projected demanded respect without coercion, and obedience emerged naturally from understanding rather than fear. Her calm demeanor contrasted with the anxiety of her husband and the awe of those around her, highlighting that true authority need not shout or threaten to exist. Her presence alone was commanding, a force both gentle and absolute. She began using her voice to guide the villagers in subtle but meaningful ways. Crops that had suffered from neglect or drought thrived under her influence. Animals strayed safely back to their owners. Disputes that would have erupted into conflict were resolved before they escalated. People began to attribute these blessings to the young woman they had once pitied, recognizing her unseen guidance as a source of protection and wisdom. The mansion, once a symbol of oppression, became a beacon of hope, radiating influence far beyond its walls. Her husband's frustration grew daily. He could no longer maintain the facade of dominance. Commands that had once been absolute went unheeded, subtle interventions seemed to counter his every move, and even his most loyal allies felt compelled to act in accordance with Amara's silent direction. He watched, powerless, as the household and village gradually aligned with the force he could neither see nor control. Fear began to replace arrogance, and desperation seeped into his demeanor. Amara's success was rooted in the clarity of her intent. Every act of influence was deliberate, every movement calculated to protect, guide, and awaken. Her unseen voice, though intangible, became a source of tangible change, inspiring courage, morality, and cooperation. She did not need to speak aloud. Her authority radiated from her presence, her focus, and the knowledge that her power was not granted by others. It was inherent, undeniable, and unassailable. By the end of this period, it was evident to all, villagers, servants, and even her family, that Amara had transcended the limitations imposed upon her. She had become a force of balance, justice, and unseen command, demonstrating that true power does not require permission to exist. The mansion, the village, and the hearts of those who had long suffered under fear now responded to her, a living testament to the might of a voice that could not be silenced. Through her calm but commanding presence, Amara revealed the profound truth. Authority is not measured by dominance, but by the ability to inspire, guide, and transform, even without a single spoken word. The confrontation came at last, as if the tension that had been building for months could no longer be contained within the walls of the mansion. Her husband, sensing the unstoppable force that Amara had become, confronted her in the grand hall, his face a mixture of fury, disbelief, and fear. The servants, who had long followed her silent guidance, watched from the shadows, their hearts pounding with anticipation. The villagers, who had begun to notice subtle but undeniable shifts in the household and estate, waited beyond the gates, whispering among themselves, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold. He demanded, his voice sharp and commanding, that she explain the inexplicable, the objects moving seemingly of their own accord, the servants' newfound courage, the sudden bursts of life and guidance emanating from the mansion. He accused her of trickery, of collusion with forces he could not see, and of daring to undermine the authority he had long wielded without challenge. But Amara remained calm, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering. She did not raise her voice, she did not respond with words. Instead, she allowed the power she had cultivated in silence to manifest fully, letting it ripple through the room with an undeniable presence. The chandeliers trembled subtly, casting shifting shadows that seemed to mirror her strength. The air thickened with a tension that was palpable yet unseen, a resonance that reached every corner of the hall. Plates and glasses shifted ever so slightly on their trays, signaling the alignment of her intent without causing chaos. The servants, emboldened by her unseen influence, stood taller, their movements precise, their confidence radiating outward. The household itself became an extension of her authority, responding instinctively to her focus. Her husband's fury faltered as he felt the immensity of her presence. Each attempt to assert control met resistance, not violent but unyielding, almost natural, as if the very fabric of the mansion recognized her rightful command. The invisible currents of her influence reached beyond mere objects, touching the minds and hearts of those present. Servants who had once cowered now acted with clarity and purpose. The villagers outside, attuned to the subtle shifts in energy and behavior, sensed the undeniable change. The young woman they had thought powerless had become a force that could not be ignored or suppressed. He tried to speak again, demanding obedience, but his words seemed hollow against the weight of her silent power. Amara's presence conveyed authority more profoundly than any shouting could have. Her eyes, calm yet commanding, communicated the truth. She had transcended the limitations imposed upon her. She was no longer merely a wife silenced by fear. She was a leader, a guide, a force of justice and clarity. The room, the mansion, and even the air seemed to hum with acknowledgement of her role. Gradually, her husband's resistance crumbled. He recognized that his attempts to dominate, to silence, and to control were futile. The consequences of underestimating her were made painfully clear. His authority, once unquestioned, had been quietly dismantled by a power he could neither see nor resist. Fear replaced arrogance in his eyes, and he understood at last that true strength did not lie in suppression, but in mastery of oneself and the capacity to influence with wisdom. The household shifted as well. Those who had endured his harshness began to look to Amara not with fear, but with respect and trust. Her calm authority inspired confidence. Her unseen guidance became a model for decision-making, fairness, and protection. The servants moved with purpose, knowing they were supported by a force both powerful and benevolent. The mansion, once a place of oppression, had become a hub of quiet strength and moral clarity. Even the villagers, witnessing the subtle but undeniable transformation, began to approach with reverence. Word spread that Amara's influence was not limited to the mansion. It reached into the lives of all who had suffered or lived in fear. She became a symbol of wisdom and authority, a reminder that true power need not be boisterous or violent to command recognition. By the end of the confrontation, her husband was forced to bow, not in submission to her voice, but to the truth of her presence. He understood the consequences of trying to silence her, and he recognized her as a figure whose strength was beyond his comprehension or control. The reckoning had come, not with violence or shouted commands, but through the quiet, unstoppable manifestation of her hidden voice. The household and village alike acknowledged her as a leader, a guardian of justice, and a woman whose authority could not be ignored, proving once and for all that power is defined not by domination, but by the ability to influence, guide, and transform without ever raising one's voice. Amara's triumph over silence did not end with her husband's acknowledgement of her power. She understood that true freedom was not merely the absence of oppression for herself, but the ability to share the tools of empowerment with those around her. The mansion, once a place heavy with fear and control, became the first seed of transformation. She began by changing the very atmosphere of the home. Walls no longer echoed with intimidation, corridors no longer carried the weight of whispered threats. Instead, the air thrummed with possibility, curiosity, and quiet confidence. She invited the servants to learn what she had discovered, the hidden ways to communicate beyond spoken words, to channel intent through presence, gestures, and subtle influence. Children of the household, often silenced by expectation, were encouraged to explore their thoughts, to express themselves through writing, art, or song, guided by Amara's patient instruction. Even the adults, hesitant at first, began to recognize the power inherent in their own voices, both heard and unspoken. They learned to influence the environment, to protect themselves and others, and to act with wisdom and courage. The village itself became part of this transformation. Amara extended her lessons to women who had long been marginalized, silenced, or dismissed. She taught them to find strength in the methods she had honed in secrecy. A glance could convey protection, a gesture could instill courage, a soft hum could inspire unity. Her teachings spread quietly but powerfully, creating networks of influence and empowerment that were impossible to suppress. Those who had once bowed to fear now stood with dignity, their voices acknowledged and respected in ways that reshaped the social fabric. The household's former oppressors, including her husband, witnessed this change with mixed emotions. Fear lingered, yes, but also awe and, eventually, a grudging respect. He saw that true authority was not enforced through domination but cultivated through guidance, clarity, and the ability to empower others. The mansion no longer symbolized control. It had become a hub of knowledge, compassion, and strategic influence. Servants, once cowering, now walked freely, confident in their skills and their understanding of Amara's teachings. Amara also implemented rituals and practices to preserve these methods. Regular gatherings allowed women to share their experiences, develop their communication abilities, and refine their unseen influence. Lessons in observation, subtlety, and empathy became central, teaching that strength could manifest in quiet, indirect ways just as surely as it could through overt action. Her philosophy was clear. Empowerment is strongest when it is nurtured, respected, and exercised wisely. Over time, the influence of this transformed household radiated outward. Villagers began to seek guidance not from force or intimidation, but from those who had learned to wield power through understanding and deliberate action. Amara's methods created a ripple effect. Families, once governed by fear, began adopting her practices of listening, subtle communication, and mutual respect. Women who had been silenced for generations found ways to contribute meaningfully, their presence no longer overlooked. By the end of these transformations, Amara's home and village had become a model of empowerment and respect. Her lessons were not simply about speaking aloud, they were about cultivating presence, influence, and wisdom, demonstrating that the most profound voices are not always the loudest, but the most enduring. The household, once a place of fear, had become a sanctuary of learning, a center of respect, and a beacon for those who sought the freedom to be heard. Through her guidance, the women and men of the village discovered that voices, once suppressed, could become instruments of transformation, shaping not just individual lives but entire communities. Years had passed, and the story of Amara had spread far beyond the boundaries of her village. Travelers from distant lands whispered her name in markets, on forest paths, and around evening fires. They spoke of the woman whose words, though once forbidden, had carried through walls, through wind, and into the hearts of all who were willing to listen. Her presence had become a legend, not because of loud proclamations or grandiose displays, but because of the subtle, unyielding power she had cultivated, a power born of patience, resilience, and the unwavering pursuit of truth. Those who met her in later years described the way the air seemed to hum with her intent, as if her influence had seeped into the very fabric of the village. Even decades after her initial struggle, the mansion she had transformed radiated authority and calm wisdom. Servants, neighbors, and children recounted how her guidance had shaped their lives in imperceptible ways. The courage to speak when silence would have been easier, the clarity to act with fairness, and the strength to protect the powerless. Travelers marveled at how one woman, once silenced, had created ripples of change that no force could undo. Her story became a proverb among generations: you may silence a voice, but you cannot still the power that speaks through truth. Mothers told their daughters and teachers guided their students with this phrase, reminding them that oppression could mute sound but never spirit. Her struggle, her methods, and her triumph were distilled into lessons of courage, ingenuity, and resilience. Women across villages, towns, and even distant regions drew inspiration from her example, learning to cultivate their own hidden strengths and unseen influence, understanding that every whispered thought, every tear shed in adversity, and every song of the heart carried the potential for immense power. Amara's legacy was not only in the transformations she achieved in her household and village but in the mindset she instilled in those who came after her. The fear that once allowed tyrants to dominate was replaced with a quiet confidence that actions, intentions, and unseen forces could shift the balance of power. Her teachings emphasized that communication extended beyond mere speech. It could manifest in presence, in careful guidance, in empathy, and in the subtle shaping of circumstances. Those who embraced these lessons found that influence need not be loud to be undeniable. As the years flowed on, her influence became woven into the culture and consciousness of the land. Scholars wrote of her methods in clandestine texts, songs were composed to honor her resilience, and children learned that even in the face of suppression, the essence of one's voice could never truly be extinguished. She became more than a woman. She became an idea, a living proof that the spirit behind words holds far greater weight than the sound itself. Travelers passing through the village would sometimes pause, sensing the resonance of her power lingering in the wind, the walls, and the streets. Villagers would point to subtle changes in behavior, in decision-making, in the collective courage of their community, all testaments to the enduring presence of Amara's voice. Her life demonstrated that even when those in power attempt to silence the truth, the underlying force, the moral, spiritual, and intellectual essence of one's convictions, could never be contained. Generations came to understand that Amara's greatest gift was showing that every whisper, tear, and song carried potential beyond its immediate expression. Her struggle became a blueprint for resilience, for reclaiming power quietly yet irreversibly. Her name and deeds reminded all that oppression could bend the body, but it could never break the spirit, nor mute the truth that resonates through time. In the end, Amara's voice could not be silenced because it was more than sound. It was life, influence, and unwavering principle made manifest. Her story endured, a beacon for women and men alike, a call to recognize that power lies not only in what is spoken, but in the steadfast truth that courses through every act of courage, every silent resistance, and every determined heart willing to defy suppression.